Hello, and welcome to this evening's journey through time. Tonight, we'll unfold another page of history and listen closely to the voices it left behind. Maybe you're lying in bed, phone screen dimmed, or maybe you've simply chosen to let the past keep you company for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world and what time it is for you. If you find comfort in slow, thoughtful stories about the people who came before us, I'd be honoured if you subscribed. Your first sensation upon waking would be the luxurious weight of fine linen sheets and rich wool blankets, a stark contrast to the straw-filled mattresses and rough hemp coverings that served most of medieval society. Your bed, a massive four-poster affair carved from oak and draped with silk curtains, would be positioned in a private chamber, a luxury beyond the imagination of peasants who shared cramped quarters with their livestock. As consciousness fully returns, you'd hear the soft shuffle of servants' feet and the gentle clink of silver and pewter as your morning meal is prepared. Your personal attendants, ladies in waiting if you're female nobility or valet if you're male, would already be laying out your clothing for the day. These aren't the rough wool tunics and simple shifts worn by commoners, but garments of silk, velvet and fine wool dyed in vibrant colours that only the wealthy could afford. The process of dressing would be an elaborate affair, layer upon layer of clothing carefully arranged. First the linen undergarments, then the main garments, followed by an outer robe or surcoat. Your clothing would be adorned with precious metals, jewels and intricate embroidery that proclaimed your status to all who beheld you. The very act of getting dressed would require multiple servants, as the complex fastenings, laces and heavy fabrics demanded assistance. Your morning meal would arrive on silver platters, a feast that would seem miraculous to the peasantry who subsisted on thin gruel and coarse bread. Fresh white bread made from the finest wheat flour would grace your table alongside honeyed cakes, roasted meats, exotic fruits, spiced wine. The stark contrast to peasant fare cannot be overstated. While common folk might taste meat only on special occasions, your table would groan under the weight of venison, fowl and delicacies imported from distant lands. But this opulent lifestyle came with its own unique set of challenges and responsibilities that would reshape your understanding of power and privilege. As nobility, you wouldn't simply lounge in luxury, you'd be thrust into a complex web of political obligations, social expectations, and very real dangers that could determine not just your comfort, but your very survival. Your daily schedule would be rigidly structured around the demands of medieval politics and social hierarchy. Morning prayers would be mandatory, conducted in your private chapel, or the castle's main religious space. The medieval world was deeply devout, and even the highest nobility were expected to demonstrate their piety through regular worship, charitable acts, and adherence to church doctrine. Following prayers, you'd likely hold court, a formal session where vassals, merchants, and petitioners would seek your judgment onto various matters. This wasn't merely ceremonial. As a noble, you'd wield genuine judicial power over your lands and subjects. Disputes over property, accusations of theft or assault, and requests for royal favour would all require your attention and decision. The weight of these choices would be enormous, as your judgments could mean the difference between life and death for those who appeared before you. The political landscape of medieval Europe was treacherous beyond modern comprehension. Alliances shifted like quicksand, and today's trusted ally could become tomorrow's mortal enemy. Marriage wasn't a matter of love, but of strategic alliance. Your spouse would be chosen to strengthen political ties and secure territory or end conflicts between noble houses. Children too would be political assets, betrothed from birth to cement future alliances, or traded like precious commodities to advance family interests. Your castle or manor would be both a fortress and administrative centre, housing not just your family, but dozens or even hundreds of servants, soldiers and retainers. The constant bustle of medieval court life would surround you. Scribes copying letters and legal documents, stewards managing your vast estates, knights training in the courtyard, and servants maintaining the complex machinery of noble household management. But perhaps the most jarring aspect of your new life would be the constant awareness of mortality that permeated medieval existence. Even as nobility, you'd live with the knowledge that death could come suddenly and violently. Warfare was endemic, and nobles were expected to lead their armies into battle personally. Political rivals might resort to assassination, and even medical treatment, primitive by modern standards, could prove fatal. The Black Death, which had swept through Europe just years before our imagined scenario, would cast a long shadow over daily life. This devastating plague had killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, sparing neither peasant nor prince. The psychological impact of such widespread mortality would colour every aspect of medieval thinking, leading to an intense focus on spiritual preparation and the afterlife. Your education, if you were fortunate enough to receive one, would centre around military training, religious instruction, and the complex etiquette of court life. Literacy, while valued, wasn't universal, even among nobility. Many nobles could neither read nor write, relying instead on educated clerks and scribes to handle written correspondence. If you were literate, your reading material would consist primarily of religious texts, classical works preserved from antiquity, and the chivalric romances that celebrated knightly ideals. The concept of privacy as we understand it today simply didn't exist. Your personal chambers might offer some solitude, but your daily life would unfold before the constant gaze of servants, courtiers, and visitors. Every meal, every conversation, every decision would be observed and analysed for political significance. Gossip and intrigue would swirl around you constantly, as ambitious courtiers sought to advance their own positions through careful observation of your moods and preferences. Your relationship with the common people would be complex and largely distant. While you might occasionally encounter peasants during travels through your lands or during public ceremonies, the vast gulf between noble and commoner meant that their daily struggles would remain largely invisible to you. The grinding poverty, constant hunger, and a back-breaking labour that defined peasant existence would be as foreign to your experience as life on another planet. Yet this distance came with its own burden of responsibility. As a noble, you'd be expected to provide protection and justice for your subjects, to lead them in times of war, and to ensure the prosperity of your lands. The feudal system that governed medieval society was built on mutual obligation. Peasants owed labour and military service to their lords, while lords owed protection and justice to their subjects. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural life would still touch your existence, though in very different ways than they affected the peasantry. Spring would bring the need to organise planting and ensure adequate seed was available for your tenants. Summer might see military campaigns, as the warmer months were preferred for warfare. Autumn would bring the harvest, a crucial time when the year's success or failure would be determined, affecting not just your wealth but your ability to feed your household through the winter months. Winter in a medieval castle would be a time of relative isolation, as poor roads and harsh weather limited travel and communication. Your household would draw inward, relying on stored provisions and preserved foods to survive until spring. Entertainment during these long months might include feasts, musical performances, storytelling and indoor games, but the cold and darkness would affect even the most privileged households. The religious calendar would punctuate your year with festivals, fasts and holy days that the entire Christian world observed. Easter and Christmas would be times of great celebration, marked by elaborate feasts and gift-giving. The 40 days of Lent would require even nobles to observe periods of fasting and penance, though your version of deprivation would still surpass the daily fare of most commoners. Your wardrobe would be a visible proclamation of your status and wealth. Fine furs from distant lands, silk imported from the east, and precious metals worked into intricate jewellery would adorn your person. The sumptuary laws of many medieval kingdoms actually regulated what colours and fabrics different social classes could wear, ensuring that clothing served as an immediate identifier of social rank. The question of succession would hang constantly over your household. Producing legitimate heirs would be not just a personal desire, but a political necessity. The death of a lord without clear succession could plunge entire regions into warfare as various claimants fought for control. If you were female, your value would be largely determined by your ability to form advantageous marriages and produce male heirs to continue the family line. Your daily diet would include luxuries that most people could never imagine tasting. Exotic spices from the east, pepper, cinnamon, cloves and nutmeg would flavour your food. These spices were literally worth their weight in gold, yet they would appear regularly on your table. Fresh meat would be available year-round, either from your own hunting expeditions or from the carefully managed livestock on your estates. The concept of personal hygiene, while different from modern standards, would still set you apart from the common people. You'd have access to soap, perfumes and regular bathing, luxuries that peasants could rarely afford. Your clothing would be changed regularly, and you'd have servants dedicated to maintaining your appearance and comfort. But beneath all this accursed luxury and privilege would run an undercurrent of violence and uncertainty that modern people can scarcely imagine. Medieval justice was swift and brutal. Executions, mutilations, and public floggings were common punishments that you might be expected to witness or even order. The sight of heads mounted on castle walls or bodies hanging from gibbets would be unremarkable parts of the landscape. Your military obligations would be very real and potentially deadly. As a noble, you'd be expected to provide knights and soldiers for your overlord's armies, and quite possibly to lead them personally into battle. Medieval warfare was brutal and chaotic, with hand-to-hand combat using swords, axes, and maces. Even with the best armour and weapons, survival in battle was far from guaranteed. The political intrigue of court life would require constant vigilance and diplomatic skill. A careless word or misinterpreted gesture could create enemies who might plot your downfall for years. The rise and fall of noble families was often swift and dramatic. Today's powerful duke could become tomorrow's exiled traitor, stripped of lands and titles, possibly even executed for treason. Your relationship with the church would be complex and multifaceted. While personal piety was expected and often genuine, the church was also a major political force with its own agenda. Bishops and abbots wielded significant temporal power, controlling vast lands and wealth. Your donations to the church would be both a spiritual obligation and a political necessity, as ecclesiastical support could make or break noble careers. The education of your children would be carefully planned to prepare them for their future roles. Sons would be trained in warfare, hunting, and the management of estates. They might be sent to serve as pages and squires in other noble households, learning the complex code of chivalry that governed knightly behaviour. Daughters would be educated in household management, music, and the social graces necessary for advantageous marriages. Your castle or manor house would be a marvel of medieval engineering and luxury, yet still primitive by modern standards. Massive stone walls would provide security, but also create damp, cold living conditions. Fireplaces would offer warmth and light, but also fill rooms with smoke. Glass windows, if you had them at all, would be small and made of thick, distorted panes that provided little clear view of the outside world. The feast hall would be the centre of your social life, where elaborate meals served multiple political and social functions. The seating arrangements at your table would communicate complex hierarchies of status and favour. The quality and variety of food served would demonstrate your wealth and power to guests and rivals alike. These feasts weren't merely social gatherings, but important political events where alliances were forged, disputes settled, and status affirmed. Your household staff would number in the dozens or hundreds, each with specific roles and responsibilities. Stewards would manage your estates and finances, a chamberlain would oversee your personal quarters, marshals would command your military forces, and a chaplain would tend to your spiritual needs. The complex web of relationships among these servants would create its own political dynamics that you would need to navigate carefully. The seasonal progress, travelling between your various properties, would be a major undertaking, involving hundreds of people and countless wagons of supplies. These journeys served multiple purposes, allowing you to personally oversee your lands, demonstrating your power to your subjects, and maintaining the complex network of relationships that held the feudal system together. Your library, if you possessed one, would be a treasure trove of hand-copied manuscripts worth enormous sums. Books were rare and precious objects, each one representing months or years of scribal labour. The knowledge contained in these volumes, everything from classical philosophy to agricultural techniques, would give you significant advantages over less educated rivals. The question of loyalty would permeate every relationship in your life. Vassals owed you service and obedience, but their loyalty could shift if circumstances changed. Servants and retainers depended on your favour for their livelihoods, creating complex dynamics of dependence and mutual obligation. Even family relationships would be coloured by political considerations and inheritance disputes. Your death, when it eventually came, would trigger a complex series of legal and political processes. Your lands and titles would need to be transferred to your heirs, your debts settled, and your soul prayed for through elaborate funeral rites and ongoing memorial masses. The way you died, in battle, from disease, or in your bed, would affect how you were remembered and could impact your family's future prospects. The contrast between your luxurious existence and the grinding poverty of the peasantry would be stark beyond modern comprehension. While you dined on exotic delicacies, your subjects might be reduced to eating bark and grass during times of famine. While you wore silk and velvet, they made do with rough wool and hemp. This inequality wasn't seen as unjust, but as the natural order ordained by God, with each person expected to fulfill their designated role in society. Your legacy would be measured not just in terms of wealth and power accumulated, but in the stability and prosperity you brought to your lands and subjects. A good lord was one who protected his people from enemies, ensured justice was dispensed fairly, and maintained the delicate balance of obligations that held medieval society together. As our journey through medieval nobility draws to a close, we return to the fundamental question: what would it truly mean to wake up as royalty in medieval times? The answer is complex and multifaceted. A life of unimaginable luxury shadowed by constant danger, unlimited power constrained by rigid obligations, and earthly glory haunted by the ever-present spectre of mortality. You would inhabit a world where your smallest decisions could affect the lives of thousands, where political missteps could mean death or exile, and where the weight of tradition and expectation would shape every aspect of your existence. Yet you would also experience privileges and comforts that most people of that era could never imagine. Fine food, beautiful clothing, magnificent surroundings, and the power to shape the course of history itself. The medieval world would challenge every assumption you hold about power, privilege, and responsibility. It would force you to navigate a complex social landscape where honour mattered more than happiness, where loyalty was the highest virtue, and where your worth was measured not by personal achievement but by your ability to fulfil the role that birth and circumstance had assigned to you. In the end, awakening as medieval royalty would be both a blessing and a burden, offering unprecedented opportunities for luxury and influence, while demanding sacrifices and accepting responsibilities that would reshape your understanding of what it means to hold power over others. It would be a life lived in the full knowledge that much had been given to you, and from you much would be expected in return. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your comfortable modern bed, perhaps you'll dream of those distant castle chambers, imagining what it might have been like to wake up in a world so different from our own, where the weight of a crown brought both unimaginable privilege and the crushing responsibility of holding the fate of nations in your hands. What if you woke up as royalty in medieval times? Part 2. But perhaps the most striking aspect of your new royal existence would be the overwhelming burden of decision-making that rested upon your shoulders. Every dawn brought with it a cascade of choices that could alter the fate of thousands. As you sat in your private chambers breaking your fast on delicate menchate bread and spiced wine, your advisors would already be gathering in the antechamber, each bearing matters that demanded your immediate attention. The morning might begin with reports from your steward about the harvest yields across your vast estates. A poor crop in the northern counties could mean the difference between prosperity and famine for entire villages. Your treasurer would present detailed accounts of the royal coffers, explaining how the costs of maintaining your court, funding military campaigns, and supporting the church were stretching the kingdom's resources thin. The marshal of your household would seek approval for new fortifications along the border, where neighbouring lords had been making increasingly bold incursions into your territory. But these were merely the administrative concerns. The truly weighty matters would come later, presented by your most trusted counsellors in the privacy of your solar. A messenger might arrive bearing news that one of your most powerful vassals had died, leaving behind a young heir and a strategic castle that controlled a vital river crossing. The decision of who would serve as regent could shift the balance of power across 3 counties. A seemingly simple choice between 2 claimants might determine whether that region remained loyal to your crown or fell under the influence of a rival kingdom. Your spy master would whisper urgent intelligence about a brewing conspiracy among the merchant guilds in your largest city. They suspected that foreign gold was funding seditious activities, but moving against them too hastily could damage trade relationships that kept your treasury solvent. Wait too long, however, and you might face open rebellion in your own capital. The captain of your guard would request permission to investigate, but such an inquiry would require delicate handling to avoid appearing tyrannical to your other subjects. The weight of these decisions would press upon you like a physical force. Unlike the common folk who answered only to their immediate lords, you bore responsibility for the welfare of everyone within your realm. A drought in the eastern provinces would require you to decide whether to open the royal granaries, potentially leaving your armies undersupplied if war came. A dispute between two powerful noble houses over mineral rights could escalate into private warfare that devastated the countryside if not handled with perfect diplomatic precision. Your education would have prepared you for this burden from childhood, but the reality would still be overwhelming. You would have learned statecraft from the finest tutors, studied the chronicles of successful rulers, and observed your predecessors navigating similar challenges, yet theory and practice remained vastly different beasts. The consequences of your choices would ripple outward in ways impossible to fully predict, affecting lives you would never see and futures you could barely imagine. Religious obligations would add another layer of complexity to your decision-making. The Church expected your support in matters both spiritual and temporal, but their interest didn't always align with the practical needs of governing. When the bishop demanded that you fund a new cathedral while your border fortresses crumbled from lack of maintenance, choosing between divine favour and earthly security required wisdom beyond your years. The threat of excommunication loomed over rulers who defied church authority too boldly, yet submitting entirely to clerical demands could leave your kingdom vulnerable to more secular threats. Your courtiers would watch your every decision with calculating eyes, each seeking to advance their own interests while maintaining the appearance of loyal service. The Lord Chancellor might advocate for one course of action, while the Marshal favoured another, and determining whose counsel served the kingdom versus who served personal ambition to became a constant mental exercise. Flattery would flow like wine at your table, but distinguishing genuine advice from self-interested manipulation required the wisdom of Solomon and the cunning of a serpent. Marriage negotiations would present perhaps the most consequential decisions of all. Your choice of spouse would determine not just your personal happiness, but the future of your entire dynasty. A marriage alliance with a neighbouring kingdom might secure peace for a generation, but it could also invite foreign influence into your court. Wedding a powerful noble from within your own realm might strengthen internal stability while limiting your options for international diplomacy. Even the timing of such unions carried enormous implications. Marry too young, and you might be manipulated by more experienced in-laws. Wait too long, and you risk dying without a clear heir. The pressure of producing legitimate heirs would weigh heavily upon you, particularly if you were a queen pregnant in an age when female rule was viewed with suspicion. Every month that passed without pregnancy would fuel whispers about divine disfavour or questions about your fitness to rule. The health of your children would become matters of state, with physicians monitoring their every symptom and courtiers speculating about the succession with each childhood illness. Military decisions would demand perhaps the most immediate and consequential choices. When raiders crossed your borders, the speed and scale of your response would determine whether the threat remained a minor incursion or escalated into full-scale war. Mobilizing your armies required enormous expense and could disrupt the agricultural cycle if timed poorly. Yet failing to respond decisively might be interpreted as weakness by other potential enemies. The lives of your soldiers would rest in your hands, their families would hold you accountable for their safe return. The complex web of feudal obligations would create constant diplomatic challenges. When two of your vassals fell into dispute, your judgment would need to balance justice with political pragmatism. Favouring one might gain you a devoted ally, but could drive the other into the arms of your enemies. The intricate hierarchy of medieval society meant that even minor decisions about precedence and honour could have far-reaching consequences. Seating arrangements at state banquets, the order of speakers at court ceremonies, and the distribution of ceremonial offices all carried deep significance that could either strengthen or fracture the delicate bonds holding your realm together. Your relationship with neighbouring rulers would require constant attention and delicate manoeuvring. A casual remark to an ambassador might be interpreted as a threat or an opportunity for alliance. The exchange of gifts needed to demonstrate appropriate respect without appearing either weak or provocative. Royal marriages, trade agreements, and territorial disputes would all intersect in complex ways that demanded both strategic thinking and intuitive understanding of human nature. The administration of justice would place you in the position of ultimate arbiter for your realm's most serious crimes and disputes. Cases involving treason, murder, and conflicts between major noble houses would come before your throne, requiring you to weigh evidence, consider precedent, and render verdicts that balanced mercy with the need to maintain order. Your reputation for fairness would determine whether your subjects sought royal justice or tried to resolve their conflicts through private violence. Economic decisions would affect every level of society, from the grandest noble houses to the humblest peasant families. Decisions about taxation, trade regulations, and currency could stimulate prosperity or trigger recession. The temptation to solve immediate problems through heavy taxation would need to be balanced against the long-term health of your kingdom's economy. Devaluing your currency might provide short-term relief for royal debts but could devastate the savings of your merchant class. The burden of these endless decisions would leave you longing for the simple certainties of common life. A peasant's choices were limited but clear. Plant in spring, harvest in autumn, and trust in God's providence. Your choices were vast but fraught with uncertainty, each decision branching into countless potential futures. The crown that adorned your head would feel heavier with each passing day, not from its physical weight, but from the accumulated pressure of ruling human lives and destinies. Yet perhaps the greatest challenge would be the isolation that came with supreme authority. While surrounded by courtiers and advisors, you would find genuine friendship nearly impossible to achieve. Those around you would always have agendas, ambitions, and interests that coloured their interactions with the crown. The simple pleasure of honest conversation would become a rare luxury, as even your closest companions would need to consider the political implications of every word they spoke in your presence. Sleep would bring little respite, as the weight of unresolved decisions and looming challenges would follow you into your dreams. You might find yourself lying awake in your luxurious bed, staring at the rich tapestries that decorated your chamber walls, wondering whether the choice you made about grain reserves would prevent famine, or whether the marriage alliance you negotiated would secure peace or invite invasion. The responsibilities of kingship would prove to be a burden that no amount of wealth or privilege could fully compensate. This, then, would be the true nature of your royal awakening, not merely a transformation from poverty to wealth, but from the simple struggles of survival to the complex burdens of leadership. The golden crown would prove to be both a symbol of ultimate privilege and the heaviest chain imaginable, binding you to duties and decisions that would shape the lives of countless souls across your medieval realm. Waking up as medieval royalty. The political web you've awakened to, silken sheets and golden goblets, but the true awakening comes when you realise that your royal blood has placed you at the centre of a deadly game where every smile hides a dagger and every alliance could crumble with a whispered rumour. The opulent chambers that seemed like paradise yesterday now feel more like a gilded cage. Because in medieval times, being royalty meant navigating a labyrinth of political intrigue that could elevate you to legendary status, or see you meeting a rather unpleasant end before your next birthday feast. The moment you take your first steps through those marble corridors as a medieval monarch, you're not just walking through a palace, you're walking through a minefield of competing interests, ambitious nobles, and foreign threats that would make modern politics look like a children's tea party. Every person who bows before you is simultaneously calculating how they might benefit from your favour, or, if necessary, your downfall. The ornate tapestries adorning your walls don't just depict heroic battles of the past. They're essentially a visual reminder that your own story could end just as violently if you make the wrong political move. Your daily schedule wouldn't be filled with leisurely pursuits and royal banquets, though those certainly existed. Instead, you'd find yourself in an endless series of council meetings, diplomatic negotiations, and strategic planning sessions that would determine not just your own fate, but the fate of thousands of subjects whose lives hung in the balance of your decisions. The weight of the crown on your head would pale in comparison to the weight of responsibility pressing down on your shoulders, because every choice you made as a medieval ruler had the potential to spark wars, create famines, or establish peace that could last for generations. The feudal system that sustained your kingdom was built on a complex web of personal relationships and mutual obligations that you'd need to master if you hoped to survive more than a few months on the throne. Your nobles weren't just courtiers offering flattery and entertainment. They were powerful landowners with their own armies, their own ambitions, and their own ideas about how the kingdom should be run. Each duke, earl, and baron who knelt before you controlled vast territories and commanded the loyalty of hundreds or thousands of knights and soldiers who might fight for you today but could just as easily march against you tomorrow if their lord decided your rule was no longer in their best interests. The art of medieval diplomacy required you to be part chess master, part actor, and part fortune teller, constantly anticipating moves that were 3 steps ahead while maintaining the appearance of confident authority, even when you had no idea what you were doing. You'd need to reward loyalty without appearing weak, punish betrayal without seeming tyrannical, and balance competing interests without favouring any faction so much that the others felt compelled to unite against you. the slightest miscalculation could transform your most trusted advisor into your most dangerous enemy. Because in a world where personal honour and family legacy meant everything, perceived slights could fester into blood feuds that lasted for generations. Managing your royal court would be like conducting an orchestra where half the musicians were trying to play different songs while the other half were plotting to steal your baton. The elaborate ceremonies and formal protocols that governed court life weren't just pageantry, they were carefully choreographed displays of power and hierarchy designed to reinforce your authority while giving ambitious nobles specific roles and responsibilities that kept them busy competing with each other instead of conspiring against you. Every feast became a political statement about who sat where, who was served first, and who received the choicest portions, because these seemingly trivial details communicated volumes about royal favour and political standing to everyone watching. Your marriage wouldn't be a matter of love or personal choice, but rather the most important diplomatic tool at your disposal, capable of forging alliances with neighbouring kingdoms, securing peace treaties, or gaining access to crucial trade routes and military resources. The person sharing your bed would likely be chosen by advisors and negotiated like any other treaty, with dowries, territorial concessions, and political agreements all factored into the arrangement long before you ever laid eyes on your future spouse. Even your children wouldn't truly belong to you, but would instead be viewed as valuable political assets to be married off, educated, or positioned used strategically to advance the kingdom's interests and secure the royal succession. The constant threat of warfare loomed over every decision you made as a medieval monarch, because conflicts could erupt suddenly over territorial disputes, succession crises, trade disagreements, or even personal insults between royal courts. Your kingdom's survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance between military strength and diplomatic finesse, knowing when to show force and when to negotiate, when to honour alliances, and when to quietly abandon them for more advantageous arrangements. The knights and soldiers who formed your military might were bound to you through the feudal system, but their loyalty ultimately depended on your ability to provide them with land, wealth, and opportunities for glory in battle. Medieval intelligence networks would become your lifeline in a world where information was power and ignorance could be fatal, requiring you to cultivate a web of spies, informants, and loyal agents who could keep you informed about potential threats both within your own kingdom and beyond its borders. You'd need to know which nobles were meeting in secret, which foreign ambassadors were making unusual requests, which merchants were reporting strange troop movements, and which servants had overheard conversations that might indicate brewing conspiracies. The art of medieval espionage was far more sophisticated than many people realise, with coded messages, secret symbols, and elaborate networks of communication that rival anything seen in modern spy thrillers. Religious authority would present both an opportunity and a challenge for your reign, as the church wielded enormous influence over your subjects' daily lives and possessed vast wealth and landholdings that could either support or undermine your rule. The Pope and high-ranking clergy could legitimise your authority through divine blessing, or cast doubt on your right to rule through religious condemnation, making your relationship with church leaders a crucial factor in maintaining political stability. You'd need to balance respect for religious authority with assertion of royal prerogatives, ensuring that church and state work together harmoniously while preventing either institution from gaining too much power over the other. The economic foundations of your kingdom would require constant attention and careful management, as royal revenues came from a complex mixture of feudal obligations, trade taxes, judicial fines, and special levies that needed to be collected efficiently without pushing your subjects to the point of rebellion. You'd oversee vast agricultural estates, bustling market towns, and emerging commercial enterprises, while ensuring that enough wealth flowed into royal coffers to fund your military, maintain your court, and undertake the massive construction projects that demonstrated royal power and provided employment for thousands of workers. Economic prosperity wasn't just about royal comfort, it was about political survival, because impoverished kingdoms attracted invasion, while wealthy realms could afford the armies and fortifications needed to maintain independence. Legal authority would place you at the apex of a judicial system where your word literally was law, but this power came with the responsibilities to dispense justice fairly and consistently if you wanted to maintain legitimacy and popular support. You would hear appeals from lower courts, settle disputes between powerful nobles, and establish precedents that would guide legal decisions throughout your realm for generations to come. The concept of royal justice wasn't just about punishment and enforcement, it was about demonstrating that even the most powerful subjects were bound by law, and that ordinary citizens could seek redress for wrongs committed against them, creating a sense of order and fairness that helped prevent the social chaos that could tear kingdoms apart. Your daily routine would be structured around audiences, councils, and ceremonial duties that served important political functions even when they seemed purely formal or decorative. Morning audiences allowed subjects to petition for royal favour, present grievances, or offer information that might be useful to the crown, while afternoon councils brought together your most trusted advisors to discuss policy matters, review intelligence reports, and debate responses to emerging challenges. Evening ceremonies and entertainments weren't just leisure activities. They were opportunities to reward loyal service, display royal magnificence, and create the kind of memorable experiences that would inspire devotion and discourage thoughts of rebellion among those privileged to attend. The burden of decision-making would weigh heavily on your conscience, as choices that seemed reasonable from a political perspective might have devastating consequences for individual subjects whose lives were affected by royal policies. Raising taxes to fund military campaigns could push farming families into poverty, while granting territorial concessions to secure peace might doom entire communities to foreign rule, and pardoning criminals to gain political support could leave their victims feeling betrayed by the very system supposed to protect them. The isolation of royal authority meant that you'd often be making these momentous decisions based on incomplete information and conflicting advice, knowing that history would judge your choices long after you were gone. Medieval communication systems would make governing your kingdom feel like trying to conduct an orchestra where you couldn't hear half the instruments and the other half were playing from sheet music that was several weeks out of date. Messages travelled only as fast as horses could carry them, meaning that events on your kingdom's borders might not reach your attention for days or even weeks after they occurred, while your responses would take just as long to travel back to where they were needed. This communication lag created opportunities for local officials to exceed their authority, or for problems to escalate beyond control before royal intervention could be effective, requiring you to delegate significant power to trusted representatives while hoping they wouldn't abuse their positions or make decisions that contradicted royal policy. The psychological toll of medieval kingship would test your mental resilience in ways that few modern leaders can truly comprehend, as the combination of absolute responsibility, constant danger, and social isolation created a unique form of stress that affected even the most capable rulers. You'd live with the knowledge that any day might bring news of invasion, rebellion, or assassination attempts, while the formal protocols of court life would create barriers between you and genuine human connection that could leave you feeling profoundly lonely despite being constantly surrounded by people. The crown that symbolized your authority would become a reminder of the distance between your royal persona and your private self, as the demands of kingship required you to project confidence and wisdom even when you felt uncertain and overwhelmed. Yet despite all these challenges and dangers, medieval royalty also offered opportunities for achievement and legacy that few other positions in society could match, allowing exceptional rulers to shape the course of history through wise governance, military leadership, cultural patronage, and institutional innovation. The greatest medieval monarchs weren't just survivors of the political game, they were visionaries who used their power to establish universities, commission magnificent artworks, codify legal systems, and create institutions that outlasted their own reigns by centuries. Your awakening as medieval royalty would ultimately present you with a choice between merely enduring the burdens of power or embracing the possibility of using that power to create something meaningful and lasting that would benefit not just your own kingdom, but future generations who would inherit the world you helped to shape. What if you woke up as royalty in medieval times? Part 4. But perhaps the most crushing burden of the medieval royal life wasn't the physical dangers or political machinations. It was the profound isolation that came with absolute power. Imagine waking each morning in your opulent bedchamber, surrounded by silk tapestries and golden chalices, yet knowing that every person who approached you wanted something. Every smile was calculated, every conversation a negotiation, every friendship suspect. The very nature of medieval kingship created an impenetrable barrier between you and genuine human connection. Your courtiers would bow and scrape, speaking in flowery language designed to flatter rather than inform. They would tell you what they thought you wanted to hear, not what you needed to know. The weight of this deception would press down on you like a heavy cloak, suffocating your ability to trust anyone completely. Consider the tragic example of King Richard II of England, who ascended to the throne as a child and grew increasingly paranoid and isolated as he aged, surrounded by nobles who either sought to manipulate him or challenge his authority. Richard retreated into a world of elaborate ceremony and artistic patronage. He commissioned portraits that depicted him as almost godlike, desperately trying to project an image of divine authority while privately struggling with crushing loneliness and self-doubt. Your daily interactions would be choreographed performances. At meals, you would sit elevated above your courtiers, physically separated by your royal dais. During audiences, subjects would approach on their knees, forbidden to make direct eye contact. Even your most intimate advisors would maintain formal protocols that reminded you constantly of the gulf between your station and theirs. The isolation would be particularly acute when making the life and death decisions that defined medieval rulership. When faced with whether to execute a traitor, declare war on a neighbouring kingdom, or impose new taxes on your struggling peasantry, you would ultimately sit alone with the weight of these choices. Your advisors could offer counsel, but the final responsibility and the moral burden would rest entirely on your shoulders. This solitude would extend to your personal relationships as well. Marriage, as we've discussed, would be a political alliance rather than a romantic partnership. Your spouse might be from a foreign land, speaking a different language, raised with different customs. Even if affection eventually developed, the relationship would always be shadowed by the political calculations that created it. Children would be assets to be managed, their marriages and careers subordinated to the needs of the dynasty. The psychological toll of this isolation cannot be overstated. Many medieval monarchs turned to religion as their only source of genuine solace, spending hours in private prayer or retreating to monasteries for spiritual guidance. Others became consumed by paranoia, seeing threats and conspiracies everywhere. Some, like King Charles VI of France, suffered complete mental breakdowns, possibly exacerbated by the impossible pressures of their position. Your emotional life would be stunted by the constant need to project strength and authority. Showing weakness, doubt, or fear could be interpreted as unfitness to rule, potentially triggering rebellions or coups. You would learn to bury your natural human emotions behind a mask of royal dignity, never able to express frustration, sadness, or uncertainty without political consequences. The irony of medieval royal power was that the more authority you possessed, the less freedom you actually enjoyed. A peasant might live in poverty and hardship, but he could speak his mind to his family, form genuine friendships based on mutual affection, and make personal choices about his daily life. As a monarch, your every word would be analysed for political meaning, your every relationship would serve some greater purpose, and your personal desires would be subordinated to the needs of the crown. This isolation would be compounded by the burden of historical legacy. You would be acutely aware that your actions would be recorded by chroniclers and judged by future generations. Every decision would carry the weight of how it might appear in the history books. Would you be remembered as a wise and just ruler, or as a tyrant? Would your dynasty continue to flourish, or would your mistakes lead to its downfall? The pressure to live up to the examples of legendary rulers, Charlemagne, William the Conqueror, Richard the Lionheart, would be enormous. These figures had been mythologized over time, their failures forgotten, and their successes amplified. You would be constantly measured against these impossibly high standards, knowing that your own human flaws and mistakes would be scrutinized with merciless precision. Yet perhaps most heartbreaking of all would be the knowledge that despite all your power and privilege, you were ultimately as mortal and vulnerable as any of your subjects. Medieval monarchs died young, from disease, violence, and the stress of their position. The crown that granted you such authority would also be the source of your greatest suffering, a golden prison from which there was no escape except death. The weight of kingship would follow you into your dreams, where you might find brief respite in sleep only to wake again to the crushing reality of your responsibilities. In those quiet moments before dawn, lying in your royal bed, surrounded by luxury yet utterly alone with your thoughts, you would perhaps understand the terrible truth of medieval monarchy, that absolute power was, in the end, absolutely isolating. This emotional and psychological burden would affect every aspect of your rule. Unable to form genuine relationships or trust completely in anyone's motives, you might make increasingly erratic decisions. The isolation could drive you to surround yourself with flatterers and yes-men, cutting yourself off from the honest counsel you desperately needed. Alternatively, you might become suspicious of everyone, seeing enemies and conspiracies where none existed. The tragedy of medieval royal life was that the very system designed to elevate you above all others would ultimately diminish your humanity. In gaining a crown, you would lose the simple pleasures and authentic connections that make life meaningful. The golden throne that symbolized your power would become, in the end, the loneliest seat in the kingdom. Here's part 5 of your 12-part script for What If You Woke Up as Royalty in Medieval Times. The weight of the crown was nothing compared to the crushing burden of the decisions that came with it. Every choice you made as a medieval ruler rippled outward through your kingdom, affecting thousands of lives in ways both seen and unseen. The power to shape destinies, to determine who lived in comfort and who struggled in poverty, to declare war or forge peace, these responsibilities would have consumed your every waking moment. Your day would begin before dawn, not with leisure but with urgent matters demanding immediate attention. Advisors would crowd into your chambers, each bearing news that required swift judgment. A dispute between neighbouring lords threatened to escalate into bloodshed. Reports arrived of raiders attacking merchant caravans on the kingdom's borders. The royal treasury was running low, necessitating new taxes that would burden your already struggling subjects. A neighbouring kingdom had sent envoys with what appeared to be either a marriage proposal or a thinly veiled threat of invasion. Each decision carried profound consequences. Choose to support one lord over another in their territorial dispute, and you might gain a powerful ally but create a bitter enemy. Send troops to defend the merchant routes, and you protect vital trade but leave other borders vulnerable. Raise taxes to fund your military, and you might preserve the kingdom's security while driving your people deeper into poverty. Accept the foreign marriage proposal, and you could secure a valuable alliance while potentially sacrificing your personal happiness and freedom. The psychological toll of wielding such power would have been immense. Every choice meant that someone, somewhere, would suffer for your decision. When you ordered soldiers to war, you were sending young men to their deaths. When you imposed new taxes, you were taking bread from the mouths of peasant children. When you granted land to one noble family, you were denying it to another who might have equally valid claims. The knowledge that your comfort and luxury came at the direct expense of your subjects' hardship would have weighed heavily on any conscience not completely hardened by absolute power. Your advisors would have been a mixed blessing, both essential allies and potential threats. The Royal Council typically included the Chancellor, who managed the kingdom's administration, the Treasurer, who controlled the purse strings, military commanders, who led your armies, and various nobles, whose support you needed to maintain power. Each advisor brought their own agenda, their own ambitions, their own vision for the kingdom that might conflict dramatically with yours or with each other. Navigating these competing interests required constant vigilance and political acumen. The Chancellor might push for expanding the royal bureaucracy to increase his own influence. Military leaders would always advocate for larger armies and more aggressive foreign policies. Noble advisors would seek favourable treatment for their own lands and families. Religious leaders would demand that all policies align with church doctrine. Balancing these competing demands while maintaining your own authority would have been like walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. The isolation that came with absolute power would have been perhaps the cruelest aspect of royal life. You could never be certain if someone's friendship was genuine or motivated by what they hoped to gain from you. Even your closest companions might harbour secret resentments or ambitions that could one day turn them against you. The higher you rose in the feudal hierarchy, the fewer people you could truly trust, until at the very pinnacle, you might find yourself utterly alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of courtiers and servants. Your personal relationships would have been complicated by the fact that everyone around you had something to gain or lose based on your favour. Your spouse might love you genuinely, or they might be playing a long game to advance their family's interests. Your children would be both your greatest joy and your greatest vulnerability, potential heirs to cherish and protect, but also possible rivals who might grow impatient waiting for their inheritance. Even your siblings could become threats if they believed they had a stronger claim to the throne, or if ambitious nobles convinced them to challenge your rule. The medieval justice system placed enormous moral burden on royal shoulders. As the ultimate arbiter of justice, you would regularly face decisions about life and death. Peasants accused of poaching on royal lands might face execution unless you showed mercy. Nobles caught in treason would expect their rank to protect them, but pardoning them might encourage others to test your resolve. The judicial system often relied more on your personal judgment than on consistent legal principles, meaning that your mood, your advisor's influence, or your current political needs might determine whether someone lived or died. Your leisure time, what little existed, would have been carefully orchestrated performances rather than genuine relaxation. Royal hunts were elaborate affairs designed to display your wealth and power to important guests. Feasts were diplomatic tools where seating arrangements, menu choices, and entertainment all carried political significance. Even your hobbies would have been scrutinised for what they revealed about your character and priorities. A king who spent too much time reading might be seen as weak and scholarly rather than strong and decisive. One who focused too heavily on military pursuits might be viewed as warmongering and reckless. The economic pressures of medieval kingship would have been relentless. Your kingdom's wealth came primarily from agriculture, but harvests were unpredictable and often insufficient. Trade provided additional revenue, but merchants needed protection and infrastructure that required costly investment. Wars were ruinously expensive, but appearing weak invited invasion. Maintaining castles, paying soldiers, supporting the royal court and funding religious institutions all drained the royal treasury faster than taxes could replenish it. You would have been forced to make impossible choices between competing necessities, invest in military strength to protect the kingdom, but watch as domestic needs went unmet and your people suffered. Focus on improving agriculture and trade but risk being conquered by better armed neighbours. Build magnificent cathedrals and palaces to project power and legitimacy, but bankrupt the royal treasury in the process. Every financial decision carried risks that could ultimately threaten your reign or your kingdom's survival. The burden of legacy would have haunted your every decision. Medieval rulers understood that their actions would be remembered and judged not just by their contemporaries but by future generations. The pressure to be remembered as a great king rather than a failure would have influenced everything from military campaigns to domestic policies. The fear of being the monarch who lost the kingdom, who allowed enemies to conquer your people, or who left your realm weaker than you found, it would have been a constant source of anxiety. Your relationship with the church would have been particularly complex and fraught with tension. As a Christian ruler, you were expected to support and protect the faith, but the church's growing power and wealth often conflicted with royal interests. Bishops and abbots controlled vast lands and resources that you might desperately need for your kingdom's defence or development. Church doctrine might conflict with political necessities, forcing you to choose between spiritual obligations and practical governance. The Pope's authority to excommunicate rulers who defied church teaching created an additional layer of political vulnerability that could turn your own subjects against you. The daily routine of medieval kingship would have been exhausting in its relentless demands. Your morning might begin with reports from spies about neighbouring kingdoms' military movements. Administrative duties would consume hours as you reviewed tax collections, approved expenditures and settled legal disputes. Diplomatic meetings with foreign envoys required careful attention to protocol and hidden meanings. Military planning sessions demanded understanding of complex strategic considerations. Afternoon audiences with petitioners meant listening to an endless stream of requests, complaints and pleas for royal intervention. Even your meals would have been working sessions where important discussions took place over elaborate multi-course feasts. The evening might bring entertainment, but even musical performances and storytelling served political purposes, reinforcing your image and messaging to important guests. Your bedtime would finally arrive only after ensuring that your guards were properly positioned, your advisors briefed on tomorrow's challenges and urgent matters addressed that couldn't wait until morning. The physical demands of medieval rulership would have been substantial. Despite the material comforts available to royalty, leading armies in battle meant wearing heavy armour for hours while making life-or-death tactical decisions under extreme stress. Travelling throughout your kingdom to maintain personal relationships with distant nobles meant long journeys on horseback over rough terrain. Participating in tournaments and hunts required athletic skill and endurance, as physical prowess was considered essential to royal legitimacy. Perhaps most challenging of all would have been the realization that despite wielding seemingly absolute power, you were actually constrained by countless limitations. Noble families whose support you needed for legitimacy could withdraw their backing if they disapproved of your policies. The church could undermine your authority through religious sanctions. Foreign kingdoms could threaten invasion if you appeared weak. Your own people could rebel if pushed too far by taxation or oppression. Economic realities limited your options regardless of your personal desires. Even the weather and natural disasters could destroy your carefully laid plans and force you to start over. The medieval king or queen existed in a paradox of ultimate authority and complete vulnerability. You could order the execution of any subject, but your own life remained constantly at risk. from assassination, rebellion, or foreign conquest. You could live in unimaginable luxury but never enjoy the simple pleasure of a private moment or an honest conversation. You could shape the destiny of thousands, but your own fate remained largely beyond your control, subject to the whims of war, disease, political intrigue, and the endless machinations of those who sought to use or replace you. The crown may have been made of gold and precious gems, but it was also forged from responsibility, isolation, and the crushing weight of power that no human being was truly equipped to bear alone. Looking at the provided reference materials and summary, here's part 6 of the script, continuing from where you left off. But perhaps nowhere was the weight of royal responsibility more crushing than in matters of faith and divine authority. As God's appointed ruler on earth, you weren't just governing bodies but souls. Every decision carried eternal consequences not just for yourself but for your entire kingdom. The church watched your every move, ready to declare your reign blessed or cursed based. You'd wake each morning knowing that heretics walked among your subjects, that witches might be practicing dark arts in hidden corners of your realm, that the very salvation of your people rested on your ability to root out evil and maintain God's favour. The Inquisition's reports would arrive regularly, detailing confessions extracted under torture, naming names of those who had strayed from the path of righteousness. Your signature on a death warrant wasn't just ending a life, it was supposedly saving a soul and protecting your kingdom from divine wrath. The psychological toll was immense. You'd sit in your private chapel for hours, praying for guidance on whether to burn the accused witch whose children begged for mercy outside your gates. Was their mother truly in league with Satan, or was she simply a healer whose knowledge of herbs had been twisted by fearful neighbours? The wrong choice could damn not just her, but potentially bring God's punishment upon your entire realm through plague, famine, or military defeat. Your own spiritual state became a matter of kingdom security. A single mortal sin could theoretically invalidate your divine right to rule. Your confessors held enormous power, knowing secrets that could topple dynasties. You'd spend sleepless nights wondering if your last confession was complete enough, if that moment of anger toward a disobedient vassal constituted the sin of wrath, if your enjoyment of fine foods crossed into gluttony, the sacraments themselves became political weapons. Excommunication wasn't just spiritual exile, it released your subjects from their oaths of loyalty and invited neighbouring rulers to invade with papal blessing. You'd watch other monarchs brought low by conflicts with Rome, their kingdoms torn apart by religious civil war, and wonder if you were one theological disagreement away from the same fate. Even your daily routines carried religious weight, which saints you honoured, how long you spent in prayer, whether you attended multiple masses. Everything was scrutinised for signs of your spiritual health. Your court chaplains weren't just advisors but monitors reporting to bishops who reported to Rome. Privacy in matters of faith was impossible when your soul's condition was considered a matter of state security. The burden extended to your family. Your children's religious education wasn't just about their salvation, but about the future of the dynasty. A heretical heir could invalidate the entire royal line. You'd agonise over their tutors, their reading materials, their companions, knowing that a single corrupting influence could destroy everything your ancestors had built. And then there were the Crusades, holy wars that demanded you choose between your kingdom's resources and your eternal soul. Refusing the Pope's call to reclaim the Holy Land marked you as spiritually deficient, but answering it meant bleeding your treasury dry and leaving your realm vulnerable to enemies. You'd send your finest knights to die in distant deserts, wondering if their sacrifice truly served God or merely papal ambition. The relics in your treasury weren't just treasures, but talismans of divine protection. Losing a fragment of the true cross or a saint's bone to enemy raiders wasn't just a material loss, but a spiritual catastrophe that could shake your subjects' faith in your divine mandate. You'd spend fortunes acquiring holy artifacts, never certain if they were genuine or clever forgeries sold by unscrupulous merchants. Perhaps most crushing was the knowledge that despite all your power, you remained utterly dependent on forces beyond your control. A solar eclipse could be interpreted as a god's displeasure with your rule. A comet might signal divine judgment. Even your dreams were subject to interpretation by court astrologers and theologians, searching for heavenly messages about your fitness to rule. The weight of representing God on earth while knowing yourself to be fallible and human created a psychological prison from which there was no escape. You were simultaneously the most powerful person in your realm and the most spiritually vulnerable, responsible not just for governing wisely, but for maintaining the cosmic order itself. Every decision echoed through eternity. Every mistake threatened not just political consequences, but the very salvation of your soul and the souls of all those under your care. This divine burden, perhaps more than any earthly concern, made medieval kingship a crown of thorns rather than gold. A position where ultimate earthly power came wrapped in ultimate spiritual responsibility, creating a paradox of authority that could crush even the strongest will under its overwhelming weight. Part 7. The deadly reality of medieval justice and law. So far we've explored the harsh realities of daily existence for those who found themselves thrust into medieval royalty. The opulent feasts, the crushing political pressures, the constant threat of disease and assassination. All of these formed the backdrop against which a ruler had to navigate one of their most feared responsibilities, dispensing justice. Imagine waking up as a medieval king or queen to discover that your very survival depends not just on keeping your nobles happy or your enemies at bay, but on making life and death decisions that could determine whether hundreds of people live or die. The medieval justice system was a brutal, unforgiving machine, and as ruler you were its ultimate operator. Picture yourself sitting in your great hall, the morning light filtering through stained glass windows as your advisors present you with the day's cases. Before you stands a trembling peasant accused of stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving family. Under medieval law, theft was punishable by death, specifically by hanging. The man's wife and children kneel before your throne, their faces gaunt with hunger, pleading for mercy. Their tears echo off the stone walls as you realise that with a single word you will either condemn this family to watch their father die, or risk appearing weak by showing leniency. This was not an uncommon scenario. Medieval justice operated on principles that would horrify modern sensibilities. The concept of proportional punishment barely existed. Minor crimes often carried sentences of mutilation, imprisonment in horrific conditions, or death. As a medieval ruler, you inherited a legal system built on the foundation that harsh, visible punishment would deter others from committing crimes. The theory was simple: make the consequences so terrible that no one would dare break the law. But the reality was far more complex. You quickly discover that the medieval court system was riddled with corruption, influenced by political pressures, and often served the interests of the powerful rather than true justice. Nobles could literally buy their way out of serious crimes, while peasants faced execution for offences that today might result in a fine or community service. Consider the case of trial by ordeal, one of the most terrifying aspects of medieval justice that you, as ruler, would be expected to oversee. When evidence was lacking or testimony conflicted, the accused might be subjected to trial by fire, water, or combat. In trial by fire, the accused would be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for a specific distance, then have their hands bandaged. If the wounds healed cleanly after 3 days, they were deemed innocent. God had protected them. If the wounds festered, they were guilty and faced execution. Trial by water involved binding the accused and throwing them into a body of water. If they floated, they were guilty. The pure water had rejected their sinful body. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent, but dead. Either way, families were destroyed, and you were forced to watch these proceedings knowing that superstition, not evidence, determined the outcome. As a medieval monarch, you would also encounter the practice of trial by combat, where disputes, especially among nobles, were settled through armed fighting. The belief was that God would grant victory to the righteous party. You might witness knights battling to the death over property disputes, inheritance claims, or accusations of treason, knowing that the stronger or more skilled fighter would win regardless of the truth of their cause. The punishments themselves were designed to be public spectacles of suffering. Public executions drew crowds like modern sporting events, with entire families gathering to watch hangings, beheadings, or worse. The punishment for treason was particularly gruesome: hanging, drawing, and quartering. The condemned would be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and finally cut into quarters. Their remains would be displayed throughout the kingdom as a warning to others. But even lesser crimes carried brutal consequences. Theft might result in the amputation of a hand or finger. Adultery could lead to public flogging or being locked in stocks for days while townspeople pelted the offender with rotten food and waste. Heresy, expressing religious views contrary to the Catholic Church, could result in being burned alive at the stake. As ruler, you would be expected not only to authorize these punishments, but often to witness them personally. The sight of a person burning alive, their screams echoing across the town square while smoke and the smell of burning flesh filled the air, would become a regular part of your royal duties. You would watch as the crowd cheered or jeered, some viewing the spectacle as entertainment, others as a necessary demonstration of divine justice. The psychological toll of presiding over such a system would be immense. Every decision carried the weight of life and death, and the knowledge that your choices were creating immense suffering would weigh heavily on any conscience. Yet showing mercy too often could be seen as weakness, potentially encouraging others to challenge your authority or commit crimes believing they would escape serious consequences. The corruption within the system would constantly challenge your sense of justice. Wealthy criminals could afford to bribe judges, hire skilled lawyers, or even purchase pardons directly from the crown. Meanwhile, the poor faced a system stacked against them from the moment they were accused. They had no legal representation, no understanding of complex legal procedures, and no resources to fight charges brought against them. You would also discover that the medieval justice system was heavily influenced by social class and gender. Nobles accused of crimes often faced different courts and different standards of evidence than commoners. Women accused of crimes, particularly those involving witchcraft or adultery, faced especially harsh treatment, with torture commonly used to extract confessions. The use of torture as an investigative tool would be one of the most disturbing aspects of medieval justice. You would encounter the rack, which stretched victims until their joints separated, the thumbscrew which crushed fingers, and the Iron Maiden, a coffin-like device lined with spikes. These were standard tools of medieval law enforcement. Confessions extracted under such torture were considered legally valid, despite the obvious fact that people would admit to anything to stop the pain. As a medieval ruler, you would be caught between the demands of maintaining order and the moral weight of the suffering your justice system created. The threat of rebellion was constant. If the people perceived your rule as either too harsh or too lenient, they might rise up against you. The balance between firm leadership and tyrannical oppression was razor thin, and the consequences of miscalculating could be your own execution. The religious element of medieval justice added another layer of complexity. The church held its own courts with jurisdiction over clergy and certain types of crimes, creating a parallel legal system that sometimes conflicted with royal justice. Sanctuary laws allowed criminals to escape punishment by reaching consecrated ground, leading to tense standoffs between royal and religious authorities. You might find yourself in the position of besieging a church to capture a criminal who had claimed sanctuary, knowing that violating religious law could result in excommunication, a fate that could turn your subjects against you and threaten your very legitimacy as a ruler. The economic aspects of medieval justice were equally troubling. Fines and confiscated property from convicted criminals became sources of royal revenue, creating a perverse incentive to find people guilty regardless of the evidence. The Crown's financial needs could directly influence legal proceedings, turning the justice system into a form of taxation through punishment. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the treatment of those accused of witchcraft or heresy. As a medieval ruler, you would be expected to cooperate with church authorities in rooting out these supposed threats to Christian society. The torture and execution of individuals, primarily women, accused of consorting with demons or practicing forbidden magic, would become a regular feature of your reign. The fact that these charges were often based on superstition, jealousy, or political motivations rather than any real evidence would not protect the accused from horrific deaths. The impact of this justice system extended far beyond the courtroom. Families lived in constant fear that a false accusation, a moment of desperation, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could result in torture and death. The arbitrary nature of medieval justice meant that survival often depended more on luck, social connections, and wealth than on actual innocence or guilt. Yet for all its brutality and injustice, the medieval legal system also represented humanity's attempt to create order from chaos. The concept of written law, the idea that even rulers should be bound by legal principles, and the notion that disputes should be settled through established procedures rather than pure violence. These were important steps in the development of civilization, even if their implementation was deeply flawed. As a medieval monarch, you would be forced to grapple with these contradictions daily. Every morning might bring new cases requiring your judgment, each one a reminder of the terrible power you wielded and the devastating consequences of your decisions, the weight of knowing that your words could end lives, destroy families, and perpetuate cycles of violence and suffering would be a constant burden. The isolation of medieval rulership would be particularly acute when it came to matters of justice. You could not show doubt or hesitation without appearing weak. Yet the certainty required by your position might conflict with your private doubts about the guilt of the accused or the appropriateness of the punishment. The burden of absolute power in matters of life and death would be yours alone to bear. In the quiet moments between public duties, when the screams from the dungeons below reached your chambers, or when the smoke from executions drifted through your windows, you would be confronted with the true cost of medieval justice. The knowledge that your reign was built upon a foundation of suffering, that your authority was maintained through fear and brutality, would shape every aspect of your existence as a medieval ruler. This system of justice, with all its cruelty and corruption, was not an aberration or a deviation from medieval civilization. It was an integral part of it. Understanding this brutal reality helps us appreciate both how far human society has progressed and how fragile our modern concepts of justice and human rights truly are. For the medieval ruler, dispensing justice was not just a duty, but a daily confrontation with the darkest aspects of human nature and the terrible responsibilities that come with absolute power. In medieval Scotland, the quest for food was as treacherous as any battlefield. As we continue our exploration into this harsh world, we turn our attention to a particularly grim reality that plagued even the most basic sustenance, the widespread contamination and adulteration of food and drink. Picture yourself in the bustling marketplace of a medieval Scottish burg, the air thick with the mingled scents of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and the acrid smoke from countless hearth fires. Here, among the wooden stalls and muddy pathways, merchants hawked their wares with the desperation of those who knew that survival depended on every transaction. But beneath the veneer of commerce lay a darker truth. Much of what was sold as food was neither pure nor safe. The bakers, those essential craftsmen upon whom entire communities depended for their daily bread, faced an impossible choice. With grain prices fluctuating wildly based on the success or failure of harvests, and with mouths to feed and rent to pay, many resorted to stretching their precious flour with whatever they could find. Ground acorns collected from the forest floor and pulverized into a coarse powder became a common additive. Sawdust from the carpenter's workshop, swept up and mixed into the dough, added bulk if not nutrition. Even chalk, scraped from quarries and ground fine, found its way into the baker's mixing bowl. The result was bread that bore little resemblance to the wholesome loaves we know today, dense, gritty, and often bitter. These adulterated loaves provided sustenance of sorts, but at what cost? The human body, already weakened by chronic malnutrition, struggled to digest these foreign substances. Stomach ailments, already common in an age without proper sanitation, became even more prevalent. One such baker was a man named Hamish MacLeod, whose small bakery sat in the shadow of Edinburgh Castle. For years, Hamish had prided himself on producing honest bread from pure grain. But as the harsh winter of 1348 approached, and with grain stores running dangerously low due to a poor harvest, he faced a terrible decision. His customers, already gaunt from months of meagre rations, looked to him with desperate eyes. Their children, hollow-cheeked and listless, needed bread to survive. It was on a particularly bitter morning in November that Hamish first mixed ground acorns into his dough. His hands trembled as he worked the foreign substance into the familiar wheat flour, knowing that he was compromising not just the quality of his bread, but perhaps the trust his neighbours had placed in him. Yet what choice did he have? To maintain his standards would mean having no bread to sell at all, and in turn no income to keep his own family fed. The bread that emerged from his ovens that day was darker than usual, with a texture that spoke of its adulteration. But his customers, driven by hunger that gnawed at their very souls, purchased it without complaint. Some may have noticed the change, but in a world where any bread was better than no bread, questions were rarely asked. The alewives faced similar moral quandaries. These women, often widows or those whose husbands had fallen in battle or to disease, operated the small brewing establishments that provided the communities with their primary beverage. In an age when water was often contaminated and dangerous to drink, Weak ale served as the primary source of hydration for people of all ages, from infants to the elderly. But the production of ale required grain, and grain was expensive. As costs rose and profits dwindled, many alewives found themselves forced to water down their brews. What should have been a hearty, nourishing beverage became little more than flavoured water, providing neither the calories nor the mild alcohol content that made ale so valuable as a food source. Consider the plight of Morag Campbell, an alewife in the Highland village of Inverary. Her husband had died fighting alongside Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn, leaving her with 3 young children and a small brewing operation that barely sustained them. As the price of barley soared following a series of raids by rival clans, Morag found herself faced with an impossible choice: either raise her prices beyond what her impoverished neighbours could afford, or find ways to make her limited supplies stretch further. She chose the latter, gradually increasing the amount of water she added to each batch. At first, the dilution was barely noticeable, but as desperation grew, so did the proportion of water to ale. Her customers, many of whom had known her husband and trusted her family, began to notice the change. The ale that had once provided a brief respite from their daily hardships now offered little comfort. Thin and sour, lacking the body and warmth they craved. The shame Morag felt was almost unbearable. Each morning as she prepared her brew, she remembered her husband's pride in their small business, his belief that honest work and fair dealing would see them through any hardship. Now she felt as though she was betraying not just her customers, but his memory as well. Yet when she looked at her children, their faces pinched with hunger, she forced herself to continue. The authorities, such as they were in medieval Scotland, did attempt to regulate food quality through various laws and ordinances. The Assize of Bread and Ale, borrowed from English legal tradition, established standards for weight, quality and pricing. Local officials, often appointed by the burghs or the lords who controlled them, were tasked with inspecting goods and ensuring compliance. Those caught adulterating their products faced a range of punishments, from fines to public humiliation. The pillory, that wooden contraption that held offenders by their head and hands while exposing them to the public ridicule, was a common sight in Scottish market squares. Dishonest bakers might find themselves locked in these devices, with their adulterated loaves hung around their necks, forced to endure the jeers and sometimes physical abuse of their fellow citizens. For repeat offenders, the punishments could be even more severe: flogging, branding, or even banishment from the community. Yet for all these attempts at regulation, enforcement remained sporadic and often ineffective. In a society where survival was the primary concern, and where those charged with enforcement were often struggling with the same economic pressures as those they were meant to police, corruption and looking the other way became commonplace. A baker who shared his profits with the local official might find his transgressions overlooked. An alewife who provided free drinks to the inspector might escape punishment for her watered-down brew. The impact of this widespread food adulteration extended far beyond simple economic fraud. In a population already weakened by chronic malnutrition and the constant threat of famine, the consumption of adulterated food posed serious health risks. The foreign substances mixed into bread could cause digestive problems, while the lack of proper nutrition from watered-down ale contributed to the general weakness that made medieval Scots so susceptible to disease. Moreover, the psychological impact of this deception was profound. In a society built on personal relationships and community trust, the knowledge that even the most basic necessities might be compromised created an atmosphere of suspicion and despair. People could not even trust their daily bread, literally and figuratively. This erosion of social bonds in communities already under immense pressure from warfare, disease and economic hardship only added to the general misery of medieval life. The spice trade, that lucrative but perilous business that brought exotic flavours from distant lands to European tables, was equally susceptible to fraud and adulteration. The precious substances that made the difference between a nobleman's feast and a peasant's gruel were often mixed with cheaper alternatives or contaminated during their long journey from the east. Pepper, worth its weight in silver, might be mixed with ground mustard seed or even small stones to increase its weight. Saffron, more valuable than gold, was frequently adulterated with turmeric or other yellow substances that could mimic its colour, if not its distinctive flavour. Even salt, the most basic of preservatives, was often contaminated with sand, dirt or other impurities that made it less effective at preventing spoilage and potentially harmful to consume. The merchants who dealt in these precious commodities faced their own moral dilemmas. Having invested enormous sums in purchasing spices in distant markets and having risked life and fortune on the dangerous journey home, they were under tremendous pressure to recoup their investments. When a shipment arrived damaged by seawater, infested with insects, or partially spoiled, the temptation to salvage what they could through creative blending with cheaper substances was often irresistible. One such merchant was David Stewart, a younger son of a Highland clan who had invested his small inheritance in a trading venture to the Mediterranean. After months of travel and negotiation, he had managed to purchase a small quantity of precious spices in Venice. But the return journey had been fraught with disaster. Storms at sea had damaged much of his cargo, and what remained was of questionable quality. Faced with the choice between returning home empty-handed and in debt or attempting to pass off his damaged goods as premium spices, David chose the latter. He carefully mixed his water-damaged pepper with cheaper black mustard seed, creating a blend that looked authentic to the untrained eye. His saffron, partially spoiled and lacking its characteristic aroma, was mixed with turmeric and marigold petals to restore its colour and bulk. When David finally reached the Scottish court, he presented his wares to the royal household with all the confidence he could. Muster. The prices he commanded were substantial enough to cover his debts and provide a modest profit, but the knowledge of his deception weighed heavily on his conscience, particularly when he observed the disappointment on the faces of the cooks who discovered that their expensive spices lacked the potency they had paid for. The contamination of food in medieval Scotland was not always the result of deliberate fraud. The conditions under which food was produced, stored, and transported were often so poor that contamination was almost inevitable. Grains stored in damp conditions developed mould and fungus that could be toxic. Meat hung to cure in smoky, fly-infested environments often became contaminated with bacteria and parasites. Even water, the most basic necessity, was frequently polluted with human and animal waste. The absence of any real understanding of hygiene or food safety meant that even well-intentioned food producers often unknowingly created dangerous products. The very methods used to preserve food while extending its shelf life often introduced their own risks. Salt used for curing meat might be contaminated with harmful minerals. Smoking, while effective at preventing spoilage, could introduce carcinogenic compounds. Fermentation used to preserve vegetables and dairy products could go wrong and produce toxic substances instead of beneficial preservation. This constant threat of contamination meant that every meal was a gamble with one's health. Even the wealthy, with access to the finest ingredients and most skilled cooks, were not immune to food poisoning. The death of King John of England in 1216, attributed by some chroniclers to eating contaminated peaches, serves as a reminder that in an age before refrigeration and food safety regulations, no one was truly safe from the dangers of spoiled food. For the common people of medieval Scotland, the situation was far worse. Lacking the resources to be selective about their food, they were forced to consume whatever was available, regardless of its quality or safety. Mouldy bread, rancid meat, and sour ale were often the only options available, and the choice was between eating contaminated food or starving. The psychological toll of this constant uncertainty about food safety cannot be underestimated. In a world already filled with dangers and uncertainties, the knowledge that even the most basic act of eating carried risks added another layer of stress to daily life. Parents watched their children consume food they suspected might be harmful but had no alternative to offer. The elderly and infirm, already weakened by age and illness, were particularly vulnerable to the effects of contaminated food. As we reflect on these grim realities of medieval Scottish food culture, we begin to understand why survival itself was such an achievement in this harsh world. The simple act of obtaining adequate nutrition was fraught with challenges that went far beyond mere scarcity. Even when food was available, its quality and safety were never guaranteed. The web of economic pressures, inadequate preservation methods, and a lack of regulatory oversight created a system where contamination and adulteration were not aberrations but everyday realities. Yet even in this bleak landscape there were those who strived to maintain standards and provide honest goods to their communities. Some bakers, despite economic pressures, refused to adulterate their bread. Some alewives maintained the quality of their brews, even when it meant accepting smaller profits. These individuals, whose names are largely lost to history, represented the enduring human capacity for integrity and compassion, even in the face of desperate circumstances. Their example reminds us that while the medieval world was indeed harsh and unforgiving, it was not entirely devoid of hope or human decency. Even in the darkest times, there were those who chose to do right by their neighbours, who saw their role not just as providers of goods, but as guardians of community trust and well-being. As night falls over our imagined medieval Scottish village, and the last of the merchants pack away their wares, we're left with a sobering picture of how difficult it was simply to eat safely in this distant time. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new choices between survival and integrity, new tests of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. But it will also bring new opportunities for acts of kindness, for small gestures of humanity that made life bearable even in the harshest of circumstances. In the opulent chambers of the royal palace, you open your eyes to silk sheets and golden sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. The reality hits you like a thunderbolt. You are now royalty in medieval times. But before you can even adjust to your luxurious surroundings, a harsh truth becomes apparent. With great power comes crushing responsibility, and the medieval world is far more brutal than any fairy tale ever suggested. As you rise from your canopied bed, servants immediately rush to attend you, but their faces carry a weight of expectation that chills you to the bone. You are no longer just a person, you are a symbol, a decision-maker whose every choice could mean life or death for thousands. The crown upon your head feels impossibly heavy, not from its golden jewels, but from the burden of absolute authority in an age where mercy was rare and justice was swift. Your first morning as medieval royalty begins with the sobering revelation about the food system that sustains your kingdom. While your table groans under the weight of exotic delicacies, roasted peacocks stuffed with aromatic herbs, honeyed wines from distant vineyards, and fruits that cost more than a peasant's yearly wages, you learn that your subjects survive on a diet that would horrify modern sensibilities. Their bread, when available, is often mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or chalk to stretch the meagre flour supplies. Unscrupulous bakers, desperate to turn a profit in times of scarcity, have turned the most basic staple of life into a gritty, nutritionally barren substance that barely deserves the name bread. The ale and wine that flow freely at your court tell an equally disturbing story. While you sip from goblets of pure, rich wine, your subjects must content themselves with watered-down swill that barely qualifies as alcoholic. Dishonest brewers stretch their products with whatever liquid they can find, sometimes including water from contaminated wells that should never touch human lips. Yet in a world where clean drinking water is a luxury, even this adulterated alcohol serves a vital purpose. The fermentation process kills some of the deadly bacteria that lurk in untreated water sources. As you serve your kingdom from the castle battlements, the scope of food inequality becomes starkly apparent. The countryside stretches before you, dotted with the humble dwellings of peasants who work from sunrise to sunset just to fill their bellies with the most basic sustenance. Their diet consists primarily of pottage, a thin, watery gruel made from whatever grains, vegetables, or scraps they can gather. On fortunate days, this might be supplemented with a morsel of salted pork or dried fish, but meat is such a rarity that it's reserved for the most special occasions, or when an animal becomes too old or sick to serve any other purpose. The seasonal nature of food in your medieval kingdom presents another harsh reality. While your royal kitchens maintain stores of preserved delicacies year-round, your subjects live at the mercy of the agricultural calendar. Spring brings tender greens like nettles and dandelions, desperately forage to combat the malnutrition of winter. Summer offers a brief abundance of small, hard fruits and whatever vegetables can be coaxed from the thin soil. Autumn brings the harvest season, a time of back-breaking labour that determines whether families will survive the coming winter. But winter itself is the cruelest season, when the poorest of your subjects huddle in their draughty hovels, carefully rationing what little food remains from the harvest, while praying they can survive until spring returns. The religious calendar adds another layer of complexity to the already challenging food situation. As a Christian ruler, you must enforce the Church's strict fasting requirements, which mandate that your subjects abstain from meat and dairy products during Lent and on designated fast days throughout the year. For the wealthy, this is merely an inconvenience. They can afford to import exotic fish, nuts, and other alternatives. But for peasant families already surviving on the edge of starvation, these religious restrictions can push them past the breaking point. The irony is not lost on you that the Church, which preaches charity and compassion, often hoards vast stores of food in its monasteries, while demanding that the hungry faithful give up what little sustenance they have for the sake of their souls. The unsanitary conditions of medieval food production would shock anyone accustomed to modern standards. In peasant homes, livestock share living spaces with families, their waste mingling with food preparation areas and creating breeding grounds for disease. Even in your royal kitchens, the lack of refrigeration and proper food safety knowledge means that contamination is a constant threat. The story of King John of England serves as a sobering reminder that even royalty is not immune to foodborne illness. The king died in 1216 after consuming spoiled peaches, his body racked with dysentery that no amount of royal privilege could cure. The spice trade that brings exotic flavours to your royal table represents another stark divide between ruler and subject. The cinnamon, pepper, cloves and nutmeg that season your elaborate feasts are worth their weight in gold, literally. A pound of nutmeg in the 11th century cost as much as 7 fattened oxen, making these aromatic treasures completely inaccessible to common people. While you dine on foods flavoured with spices from the far corners of the earth, your subjects must make do with local herbs like garlic, mustard and vinegar to add any flavour at all to their bland fare. The preservation methods available in your medieval kingdom are primitive by modern standards, but they represent the difference between life and death for your subjects. Salting, smoking, drying and fermentation are the primary techniques used to extend the life of perishable foods. However, these methods often compromise both taste and nutrition. Heavily salted meats become tough and unpalatable, while the salt itself is often contaminated with impurities that can cause illness. Smoked and dried foods develop a leather-like consistency that makes them difficult to chew and digest. Even the pickling and fermentation processes, while effective at preservation, result in foods that bear little resemblance to their fresh counterparts. The constant threat of famine looms over your kingdom like a dark cloud. Crop failures due to drought, flooding or disease can plunge entire regions into starvation. During these dreadful periods, even the most basic foods become unaffordable luxuries. Desperate peasants resort to eating bark, grass, and other inedible substances just to fill their stomachs. In the most extreme cases, reports reach your court of people driven to cannibalism, consuming the flesh of the dead rather than face their own starvation. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 serves as a reminder of how quickly abundance can turn to devastation. 7 years of crop failures and economic chaos that killed millions across Europe. Your royal feast provides a stark contrast to the suffering of your subjects. The great hall fills with the aroma of roasted meats, exotic spices, and fine wines as nobles gather to display their wealth and status. Whole roasted swans and peacocks, their feathers carefully reattached for presentation, serve as centerpieces for elaborate displays of culinary artistry. Sugar sculptures, more valuable than gold, are crafted into fantastic shapes and designs that exist purely for aesthetic pleasure. Each course of your feast could feed a peasant family for months, yet it represents just one evening's entertainment for the nobility. But even these lavish displays of wealth come with hidden dangers. The rich, heavily spiced foods can cause digestive distress for those unaccustomed to such fare. Food poisoning remains a constant threat, as even the finest ingredients can spoil without proper refrigeration. The sheer excess of these feasts often leads to overconsumption, leaving nobles groaning with discomfort as they struggle to digest the massive quantities of rich food they've consumed. The social implications of food in your medieval kingdom extend far beyond mere sustenance. Food serves as a marker of social status, with the quality and variety of one's diet clearly indicating their place in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. The whitest, finest bread made from pure wheat flour is reserved for the nobility, while the greyish-brown loaves of the peasantry are derided as black bread. In some regions, laws actually prohibit commoners from consuming white bread, making dietary restrictions a matter of legal enforcement rather than economic necessity. The role of women in medieval food culture cannot be overlooked, as they bear the primary responsibility for feeding their families despite having little control over food production or distribution. Peasant women must somehow create nourishing meals from whatever meagre ingredients are available, while also preserving food for the lean winter months. Their knowledge of herbs, foraging, and food preparation techniques represents a crucial survival skill that is passed down through generations. Yet these same women face accusations of witchcraft if their culinary knowledge seems too advanced, or if their preserved foods keep better than their neighbours. The Church's influence on food culture extends beyond simple fasting requirements to encompass broader questions of morality and social control. Gluttony is condemned as a deadly sin, yet this condemnation falls most heavily on the poor, who are expected to accept their meagre rations with gratitude while watching the wealthy feast without restraint. The Church's vast land holdings and food stores give it tremendous power over the distribution of resources, yet this power is often used to maintain the existing social order rather than to alleviate suffering. Trade networks bring exotic foods to your royal table, but they also highlight the vast inequalities that define medieval society. Merchants risk their lives traversing dangerous trade routes to bring spices, wines, and other luxury foods to European markets, yet the profits from these ventures flow primarily to the wealthy. The common people who produce the raw materials for these trades, the farmers who grow the grains, the workers who harvest the salt, the artisans who craft the containers for transport, see little benefit from the international commerce that their labour makes possible. The medical understanding of food and nutrition in your medieval kingdom is primitive and often counterproductive. The prevailing belief in the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, leads to dietary recommendations that have little basis in actual nutritional science. Foods are categorised as hot or cold, wet or dry, with elaborate rules governing which combinations are appropriate for different types of people. These misconceptions often result in diets that exacerbate rather than alleviate health problems, particularly among the poor, who can afford few alternatives to the foods deemed appropriate for their constitution. The environmental impact of medieval food production methods creates additional challenges for your kingdom. Without crop rotation or soil management techniques, fields quickly become depleted and yields decline over time. Deforestation for agricultural expansion and fuel needs reduces the available land for hunting and foraging, traditional sources of supplemental nutrition for the poor. Climate fluctuations, which modern science understands as part of the Little Ice Age, create unpredictable growing conditions that make food security even more precarious. As you contemplate the complex web of factors that determine who eats well and who goes hungry in your medieval kingdom, the weight of your royal responsibility becomes ever more apparent. Every decision you make, from tax policies to trade agreements, from military campaigns to religious observances, has direct consequences for the food security of your subjects. The power to grant or withhold access to adequate nutrition is perhaps the most fundamental aspect of royal authority, and the most morally challenging aspect of medieval rule. Constant reminder that survival itself was a privilege not afforded to all. While you may enjoy the finest delicacies and most exotic spices, the vast majority of your subjects live with the daily uncertainty of whether they will have enough to eat. This fundamental inequality shapes every aspect of medieval society, from social relationships to political structures, from religious practices to economic systems. Understanding the role of food in medieval life provides crucial insight into the challenges and complexities of ruling in an age where hunger was a constant companion and abundance was a rare and precious gift. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, I'll continue the narrative from where you left off, focusing on the deeper psychological and social impacts of medieval royal life while maintaining the engaging contemplative tone established in the previous parts. But perhaps the greatest burden of medieval royalty was not the physical dangers or political machinations, but something far more insidious, the complete erosion of authentic human connection. Imagine never knowing if someone genuinely cared for you as a person, or merely sought to curry favour with your crown. Every smile could mask ambition. Every kind word might conceal manipulation. Every friendship carried the weight of ulterior motives. This psychological isolation was particularly devastating for royal children, who grew up in a world where their every action was scrutinised, their every word analysed for political implications. They learned early that spontaneous affection was a luxury they could not afford, that trust was a weapon that could be turned against them. Many medieval chronicles describe young princes and princesses as old before their time, their eyes holding a weariness that should never belong to childhood. The constant performance of royalty was exhausting. From the moment they woke until they retired to bed, medieval rulers lived under the unblinking gaze of courtiers, servants, and subjects. They could never let their guard down, never show weakness, never display the full range of human emotion that common people took for granted. A king's momentary sadness might be interpreted as weakness by his enemies, A queen's anger could spark rumours of instability. They were living symbols rather than living people, trapped within the golden cage of their own elevated status. This performative existence extended to their most intimate relationships. Royal marriages were political alliances first and foremost, with love being an unexpected bonus rather than an expectation. Imagine wedding someone you'd met perhaps once or twice, knowing that your personal happiness was secondary to the political stability of kingdoms. Many royal couples lived essentially separate lives, coming together only for state functions and the production of heirs. The loneliness within these arrangements was profound, creating emotional voids that no amount of luxury could fill. The education of medieval royalty, while extensive, was also deeply restrictive. They learned languages, military strategy, statecraft and theology, but they were often shielded from the real experiences that shaped ordinary people's understanding of the world. Their knowledge was theoretical, filtered through the lens of advisors and tutors who had their own agendas. They might understand the economics of grain production, but never feel the gnawing hunger that drove peasant uprisings. They could recite the proper protocols for receiving foreign dignitaries, but struggled to connect authentically with their own family members. The weight of legacy was another crushing burden. Medieval rulers lived with the knowledge that their every decision would be judged not just by their contemporaries, but by history itself. They were acutely aware that their choices could elevate or destroy their dynasty, that their failures might condemn future generations to civil war or foreign conquest. This responsibility created a paralysing pressure that influenced every major decision, making it nearly impossible to act on personal conviction or moral impulse when these conflicted with political necessity. Sleep, that most basic human need, was often elusive for medieval royalty. Their minds raced with the complexities of governance, the threats lurking in shadows, the impossible choices that awaited them with each dawn. Many historical accounts describe rulers lying awake through the night, tormented by decisions that had no clear right answer, haunted by the faces of those who had suffered from their choices. The luxury of their beds meant little when their thoughts provided no rest. The irony was that while common people dreamed of royal luxury, many rulers secretly envied the simplicity of ordinary life. They watched their subjects with a mixture of superiority and longing, observing freedoms they would never possess. A peasant could speak honestly to his neighbour, could choose his own spouse within his social circle, could find genuine friendship without wondering about hidden motives. These simple human experiences were largely denied to those who supposedly had everything. Even their relationship with God was complicated by their position. While they claimed divine right to rule, they also lived with the knowledge that their actions are often conflicted with Christian teachings. They waged wars that killed thousands, imposed taxes that starved the poor and made alliances with those they knew to be corrupt or cruel. This created a spiritual crisis for many devout rulers who found themselves trapped between their religious beliefs and the pragmatic demands of maintaining power. The medieval royal court was a theatre of constant performance, where every gesture carried meaning and every word could have consequences. Courtiers analysed the king's mood from his choice of clothing, interpreted political favour from seating arrangements at dinner, and read diplomatic signals into casual conversations. This environment bred paranoia and exhaustion as rulers learned to weigh every spontaneous impulse against its potential political ramifications. Perhaps most tragically, medieval royalty often died as they lived, surrounded by people but fundamentally alone. Their deathbeds were crowded with courtiers positioning themselves for the transition of power, physicians whose treatments were more political theatre than medical care, and family members who might genuinely grieve but whose tears were mingled with calculations about inheritance and succession. The human need for authentic connection, for someone to simply sit with them as fellow mortals facing the great mystery of death, was often left unfulfilled. The romantic notion of medieval royalty as living fairy tales crumbles under the weight of these psychological realities. Yes, they had material comfort beyond the dreams of their subjects, but they paid for it with their humanity, their authenticity, their ability to form genuine relationships, and their peace of mind. They were prisoners of their own privilege, trapped in golden cages that grew smaller with each passing year, each political crisis, each necessary compromise with their own moral convictions. As we reflect on this strange twist of fate, waking up as royalty in medieval times, we must acknowledge that it would be less a dream come true than a beautiful nightmare. the external trappings of power and luxury would quickly reveal themselves as elaborate disguises for a life of profound isolation, constant danger, and crushing responsibility. The crown that seems so glorious from a distance would feel impossibly heavy when placed upon your own head, weighted not just with golden jewels, but with the expectations, fears, and desperate needs of an entire kingdom. In understanding this, we perhaps gain a deeper appreciation not just for the complexities of historical power, but for the simple freedoms we often take for granted in our own lives. The freedom to speak honestly, to form genuine relationships, to make choices based on personal conviction rather than political calculation, and to sleep peacefully without the weight of kingdoms resting on our shoulders. Part 11. The Weight of the Crown. Now that we've explored the daily struggles of survival, the brutal realities of medieval justice, and the constant threat of war and disease, we must confront perhaps the heaviest burden of all, the psychological toll of absolute power itself. You see, waking up as royalty in medieval times doesn't just mean inheriting wealth and privilege, it means inheriting a crown that weighs far more than gold and jewels ever could. The moment consciousness returns and you realise the magnitude of your position, a crushing realisation sets in. Every decision you make will ripple through thousands of lives. Every word you speak could mean the difference between prosperity and famine for entire regions. The weight of these choices begins to press down on your chest like a stone slab, making each breath feel laboured and deliberate. Consider the moral complexity of medieval leadership. A messenger arrives at dawn with news that bandits have been terrorising a village on your border. Your advisors present you with options. Send troops to hunt them down, potentially starting a costly military campaign that could drain your treasury and leave other regions vulnerable. Or perhaps negotiate with the bandits, offering them amnesty in exchange for their service. But this might encourage other criminal groups to believe they too can extort concessions from the crown. Maybe you choose to relocate the villagers entirely, abandoning their ancestral homes but ensuring their immediate safety, while potentially creating a refugee crisis elsewhere in your realm. There is no clear right answer, yet you must choose, and whatever you decide, people will die because of it. This is the terrible arithmetic of medieval kingship. Every choice involves trading one form of suffering for another, one group's welfare for another's, one risk for a different, potentially greater risk. The isolation becomes overwhelming. You quickly discover that genuine human connection is nearly impossible when you hold absolute power over everyone around you. Your childhood friends, if they're still alive, now bow and scrape before you, their easy laughter replaced by nervous deference. Your siblings view you with a mixture of fear, resentment, and calculation. After all, in medieval politics, family members are often the greatest threats to a ruler's life. Even your spouse, chosen for political alliance rather than affection, may be plotting your downfall while sharing your bed. You find yourself constantly analysing every interaction, every smile, every word of advice. Is your chancellor genuinely concerned about the kingdom's welfare? Or is he manoeuvring to increase his own power? When your courtiers laugh at your jokes, is it because you're genuinely witty, or because laughing at a king's humour is necessary for survival? The paranoia that kept your predecessors alive now becomes your constant. Companion, a voice whispering suspicions about everyone who approaches your throne. Sleep becomes elusive. Night after night, you lie awake in your opulent chambers, staring at tapestries that depict glorious battles and noble deeds, while your mind churns through the impossible decisions awaiting you at dawn. The silk sheets feel suffocating rather than luxurious. The carved bedposts seem like prison bars. Even in your private moments, guards stand outside your door, and you wonder if they're there to protect you, or to ensure you don't escape the golden cage of your responsibilities. The performative nature of royal life becomes exhausting. Every public appearance is a carefully choreographed performance, where showing weakness could trigger rebellions, displaying too much emotion could be seen as instability, and appearing too distant could make you seem tyrannical. You must project strength when you feel vulnerable, wisdom when you're uncertain, and benevolence when you're forced to make harsh decisions for the greater good. Your daily schedule is a relentless parade of audiences, each petitioner bringing problems that seem insurmountable. A drought has destroyed crops in the eastern provinces. Do you raid the royal granaries, potentially leaving the capital vulnerable to siege? A plague outbreak threatens a major trading city. Do you quarantine it and destroy the economy or risk the disease spreading throughout your kingdom? Noble families are feuding again, threatening civil war. Do you take sides and potentially create powerful enemies, or attempt neutrality and risk appearing weak? The spiritual burden weighs heavily too. In an age where divine right is believed to be the source of royal authority, every failure feels like a personal rejection by God. When harvests fail, when plagues strike, when enemies triumph, the king isn't just a political failure, he's a spiritual failure, abandoned by the heavens themselves. The priests remind you constantly that your soul is responsible not just for your own salvation, but for the spiritual welfare of your entire kingdom. Every sin you commit, every unjust decision you make could damn not just yourself, but countless subjects who depend on your righteousness for God's favour. Yet perhaps the cruelest irony is how your immense power makes you powerless in so many ways. You cannot trust anyone completely. You cannot speak freely. You cannot show vulnerability. You cannot pursue personal happiness if it conflicts with political necessity. You cannot even die peacefully, knowing that your death might plunge the realm into chaos if succession isn't perfectly managed. The weight of legacy presses down as well. You're acutely aware that everything you do will be judged not just by your contemporaries, but by history itself. Future generations will read about your reign, analysing your decisions, debating your character, reducing the complexity of impossible choices to simple verdicts of success or failure. The knowledge that your every action is being recorded by chroniclers adds another layer of pressure to an already unbearable burden. As months pass in your royal life, you begin to understand why so many medieval kings became either ruthlessly paranoid tyrants or withdrew into religious mysticism. The human psyche simply isn't designed to bear this level of responsibility and isolation. Some rulers cope by becoming increasingly detached from the suffering their decisions cause, viewing their subjects as pieces on a chessboard, rather than living, breathing human beings with hopes and fears. Others seek escape in religious devotion, hoping that strict adherence to spiritual practices might somehow lighten the crushing weight of earthly responsibility. The irony becomes inescapable. You have everything anyone could want: wealth, power, luxury, influence, yet you're profoundly unhappy. You're surrounded by thousands of people, yet utterly alone. You can command armies, yet cannot command genuine affection. You can decree laws, yet cannot decree peace of mind. The peasants in their hovels, for all their suffering, can at least trust their family members and speak freely with their friends. They can show weakness without triggering political crisis. They can make mistakes without causing wars. The crown becomes a burden that grows heavier with each passing day, a golden weight that presses down on your soul until you understand viscerally why so many medieval rulers died young, their health broken not just by the physical demands of leadership, but by the psychological toll of absolute power. You realise that the greatest luxury of common life isn't wealth or comfort, it's the simple ability to be human, to be vulnerable, to trust, to love without calculation, to make mistakes without catastrophic consequences. In your darkest moments, staring out at the kingdom spread below your castle walls, you might find yourself envying the very peasants you rule. Their lives may be hard, their suffering real, but they possess something infinitely precious that your crown has taken from you forever: the freedom to simply be themselves, without the weight of 1,000 lives resting on every choice they make. This is the final crushing realization of royal life in medieval times, that power and privilege come at the cost of everything that makes existence truly human, leaving you isolated in a golden prison of your own making, surrounded by luxury but starved of the simple human connections that make life worth living. What if you woke up as royalty in medieval times?